Okay, continuing now. Greg Bahnsen's book on Van Til's Apologetic. We're starting the second section in chapter 4, which Bahnsen gives the title, Knowing as Having Belief, Truth, and Evidence. Now, the topics of belief and truth are building up toward the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief. So he's going to be talking about belief and the true part. And then the justification part of that triad may be referred to as evidence in this title, but I'm not sure. And there's no section titled evidence in this chapter. So I think that it might have been a little bit of editorial carelessness that this chapter is actually just focusing on belief and truth, at least the Bahnsen section. But at any rate, what he's doing now is trying to set the stage for discussing epistemological issues more directly. How do we know what we know? And he kind of builds it up very gradually by examining the usage of these terms in ordinary language to try to emphasize the diversity in which all of these terms can be used. So it's not like a mathematical discussion where you simply define your terms up front and lay out your axioms and then proceed with theorems and lemmas and so forth. This is more taking an inductive approach to the terminology itself, which is interesting, and maybe we should come back and discuss that at some point. But he starts off saying, apologetics involves epistemological disagreement. He's going to define epistemology in a bit. The believer claims to know that God exists and that the gospel is true, while the unbeliever claims that the Bible is false or that the existence of God is unknowable. Notice that these two assertions of the unbeliever appear to be disjunctive, in other words, different. Namely, the first one claiming that the Bible is false versus claiming the existence of God is unknowable. So you might say the atheist position versus the agnostic position. However, in terms of the discussion that Van Til has given in previous readings, to say that God is unknowable is in fact to say the Bible's claims are false. So the latter does entail the former in a way that hopefully is clear by now. So in other words, agnosticism is not really an allowable refuge in the Van Tilian discussion, because to not be certain that the Bible is true when it makes its assertions is therefore to say that the claims about God are false. Because if the claims of God were true, these would be knowable, and the unbeliever is in a posture of rebellion, not of just like darkened understanding or ignorance, or non-ethical darkening, let's say. So he goes on in this paragraph to say that the apologetical arena, it should not be just like a trading unverified assertions or testimonies and that kind of thing, but it should be an exchange of ideas based on a search for knowledge, true knowledge that's objective. So that leads up to the second paragraph, which has the title Knowing. He starts off, the word epistemology, which derives from the Greek words episteme and logos, means a discourse on or study of knowledge. Or perhaps more precisely, the logic or ordering or system of knowledge or understanding. Episteme is given by Gingrich as understanding or knowledge. But we don't want to make the etymological mistake here. The point is how it's used in English, and that's generally just a more vague rubric for discussions about how we know what we know, analysis of what knowledge is. So Bahnsen continues, middle of page 158. What do people ordinarily mean when they say they know something? There is no single simple answer to that question because the verb to know is used in such a wide variety of ways. This is obvious enough in 20th century English parlance, but it is also true of the biblical use of the term. The richness of usage is due to the different kinds of objects that are said to be known. So he's going to give three main categories of how we use the idea of knowing. First, we speak of knowing truths, facts, claims, propositions, as in, he knows that the car needs repair. The Bible also uses the word in this fashion. Second, we also speak of knowing in the sense of having an ability, as in, he knows how to fix the carburetor. The Bible speaks this way too. Finally, we speak of, third, knowing persons in the sense of acquaintance or intimacy, as in, I have known him for many years. This usage is common in the Bible. The last two senses of knowing, ability and interpersonal relationship, cannot be reduced merely to the first sense, intellectual comprehension. However, sometimes when the common locution for knowing truth, know that, is utilized, the intended sense is not limited to a barely intellectual or theoretical one. The statement, be still and know that I am God, Psalm 46:10, goes beyond an intellectual apprehension and entails both a personal relationship of trust and the ethical ability to obey the Lord. The last two senses can never be completely divorced from the first sense, either, as though they were independently intelligible. Knowing how to fix the carburetor involves knowing that it mixes fuel and air, what its parts are, etc. Similarly, knowing how to please God involves knowing that his precepts require certain things. Knowing someone personally, even in the sexual sense, minimally entails knowing some facts about that person. Similarly, those who personally know God must believe certain propositions about him. We should notice that the reverse is not necessarily the case. Knowing all the facts in a carburetor manual does not automatically confer ability to fix one. And knowing many personal facts about a famous celebrity does not involve knowing him personally. Likewise, knowing certain facts about God or his law does not automatically give one the ability, the know-how to please him, or a personal saving knowledge of him. Accordingly, for simplicity and clarity, our discussion of knowledge will focus on the intellectual sense of knowing, since it is at least part of, although not everything important about, all instances of knowledge. And throughout these illustrations, he gives scripture proof texts, which I've skipped past. So just to recapitulate here, their knowledge involves knowledge of propositions, something like having an ability, knowing something in a more practical way, and then finally in a personal way, personal. But that the two latter ways, the practical and the personal, always have the propositional knowledge, but not vice versa. Having the propositional is not enough to establish these other two. But since the first, the knowledge, the propositional knowledge, is always contained in all of the three types of knowledge, it's reasonable to focus on that initially. Next, he defines what a proposition is. He says the word proposition is used here in its strict sense as that which is expressed by an indicative sentence in a natural language. And this is a subject that would be delved into in great detail if you haven't taken a class in critical thinking or in logic. More time would be spent developing this idea. But on the other hand, if you have done those, then this material will be somewhat redundant. But the notion here is simply that there's a variety of ways to say the cat is on the mat. the mat is occupied by a standing cat. Or you could say it in a different language, German or French or something. The meaning of what's attempted to be expressed in those different sentences, that is what we call the proposition. So it's kind of like an abstraction from any particular sentence. All of these framing type points can be challenged and have been by philosophers. The focus here is going to delimit the discussion to kind of what most people would see as the most reasonable approach to take, but always keeping in mind that some of these notions are controversial, but that shouldn't stop us in trying to move forward with this analysis. So much for, in broad brushstrokes, clearing the table for what knowledge is. Next, he has a section that he titles Belief, bottom of page 159. He says, what then is knowledge in the intellectual sense? In the first place, knowledge is a subcategory of belief. To know something is at least to believe it. We do have to allow for idiomatic expressions that gain their punch by departing from ordinary usage, as in expressing shock. I know we won the lottery, but I still can't believe it. But even here, the statement would not be intelligible or convey its sense of amazement if the word know did not entail believing, in which case the statement implies, so what you're really saying, I do believe it, but still find it unbelievable. In other words, the second use of the term believable or the unbelievable is expressing more of a emotional attitude toward the state of affairs, that you won the lottery. But to say that you know you won the lottery implies that actually you do believe it in that intellectual proposition affirming sense. So in other words, Bahnsen's point here is that there can be confusions and inconsistencies in the way terms like knowledge and belief are used, but those are easily straightened out. So we can stick to this more formal way of regarding these things for the sake of philosophical discussion. Sometimes we speak of a mental event as a belief, while at other times we think of belief as a disposition to act in certain ways. So I guess an example of the latter would be when you were already a small child sleeping in your first bed, let's say, that you could get out of on your own without being lifted out by a parent. You very quickly developed a trust that the floor was going to support you when you jumped out of bed. So you could say that's a belief, but it wasn't formulated as a proposition that was then subject to question or doubt. It just was sort of, again, a tacit belief. So I think that would fall under his category, a disposition to act in certain ways. Beliefs are held with differing degrees of confidence. Compare suspicions, opinions, convictions. Some beliefs are spontaneous, but others are derived by mental investigation and inference. So the latter, par excellence, would be, let's say, a mathematical theorem or logical theorem that wasn't self-evident, but became a belief after going through the proof. Whereas a spontaneous belief would be, I just got hit by something. Boom. It hit me in the back of my shoulder. Scott Adams, in one of his podcasts recently, said that he had the experience on the golf course of feeling a whack on his back, or a tennis court, I guess. He was playing tennis and thought that somebody had whacked him with something hard. It felt too hard to be a tennis ball, so he thought maybe he was hit with a golf ball or a baseball, hurtled intentionally real fast at his back, and it sent him sprawling. But then it turned out it was a nerve condition that led to this flash of pain at a localized place in his body. So his belief that somebody had thrown a baseball at him was false, but nevertheless it was a spontaneous belief, is the point. Some beliefs are subject to voluntary control, while not all seem to be so. So this is itself, I think, is somewhat controversial. I think some people would say that you only have beliefs that are involuntary. Like you can't help but have the belief. That there's no voluntary aspect to belief. But I think certainly some of our beliefs, and perhaps even most of our beliefs, are accepted and acquired and held on the basis of authority. For example, you take even a scientific conclusion such as the Earth is revolving around the sun. Well, that's a belief we believe is true, but 90% of Americans or people in the world would not know how to justify that belief or give a proof for it, other than they've been told by teachers. And everybody believes that, and so they believe it. So it seems to me that for certain, there's a voluntary aspect, because accepting authority is somewhat voluntary. Like, even if they're holding a ruler over you and whacking your hand if you look rebellious, like the caricature of the nun in Catholic school whacking your wrist, it's still, nevertheless, you're not able to literally force a mental attitude of belief. You're only able to enforce outward conformity. So it seems to me that many of our beliefs, in fact, do have a voluntary aspect to them. In fact, you could even say they're voluntary. Although perhaps somebody would challenge that by saying they're not voluntary in the sense that you could equally well choose P or its negation. Like, it's saying that the Earth revolves around the sun is a voluntary belief for most people, but yet it's asymmetrical in the sense that denying that the Earth goes around the sun would not be voluntary in the same sense. So somebody might quibble there that even the propositions that have a voluntary aspect, there's something deeper going on where it's not exactly voluntary in the sense that you just pick either P or its negation. Like there's some justification for your voluntarily assenting to P. And that justification might be that, well, everybody believes that, perhaps, or, things like that. It keeps digging down. Some beliefs are given personal avowal, some are held without much reflection at all. Some beliefs have numerous or important consequences, whereas others are relatively insignificant. So I would say that most of our beliefs are relatively insignificant, right? Or maybe the better way to say it is that the fact that lies underneath the belief could be altered, it could be different, it's contingent, and your belief would change with it, but nothing serious would happen. So, I walk into my kitchen, I have a belief that there's a pot sitting on this stove, and there's some oatmeal in it, and there's a dish that needs washing on the counter, and a plate that's blue. So I have all of these beliefs, but all of them could be different. The plate could be red, the dish could already be cleaned up and in the cupboard. Nothing would really matter. So I'm not like personally engaged with those beliefs. They're just part of the world that I'm operating in. Some beliefs are normative for us, some are even incorrigible, but some are maintained only by concentrated effort. So I would say an example of an incorrigible belief would be that I have a toothache. Meaning that the belief that there's an ache that I'm identifying as coming from my tooth is incorrigible, because you can't deny the pain. Like, no one could refute that I have the pain, and I can't stop believing it either. Now, the network of beliefs surrounding that, for instance, it could turn out that it has nothing to do with my tooth, per se. Similar to Scott Adams getting whacked in the back by a baseball. It turned out to be a nerve condition. So, it could be something other than my tooth, but the thing that I'm calling the toothache and that I have that is incorrigible. And an example of a belief that's maintained only by concentrated effort, that one's a little harder to think of examples, perhaps of a difficult mathematical theorem, which where even the result is very counterintuitive. So you almost have to kind of like go through the derivation in order to hold that conclusion or the theorem in your head. Another one might be more practical, the result from science that most of a solid object, here's a screwdriver, is vacuum. Like the vast majority of this thing that seems to be an extended object occupying space and very hard is actually a vacuum. It's these molecules that are held in sort of a crystalline lattice where there's a lot more empty space than there is molecules. I would say that's a belief that requires something like concentrated effort to hold in your mind, because we certainly don't act as though these objects are mostly vacuum, because they interact in a very hard, robust way. Some beliefs are irrational or held inconsistently. I'm trying to think if I would put a belief in astrology, like someone that reads the astrology page every day, if we would call that an irrational belief. That's a tough one, because the person that does that does not regard it as irrational. So we're kind of making a judgment from outside. I'm trying to think if there's an example from where you have to kind of admit that it's irrational. Maybe that would be an example. I'm sure there are some of like an astronomer whose training excludes any such notion of astrology, but yet does in fact glance at the astrology page. Maybe an example of an irrational belief would be people that play the lottery, even though they've been instructed and they rationally believe and accept the fact that it's not a good deal. That you're going to lose, on the average, you're going to lose far more than your expected gain from the lottery. But yet, a belief that, well, Lady Luck's going to see me through one of these times. Or even, God will see to it that I win because I really need the money. So that would be a belief that's, I think somebody sincerely holds at some level. But yet it's irrational, even in terms of their own understanding. So here, finally, after kind of like churning up all the confusions and different ways belief can be used, the term belief, he gives a definition in the paragraph in the middle of page 160. So he says, attempting to take this diversity into account, we might characterize belief as a positive cognitive attitude toward a proposition, an action-guiding mental state on which a person relies, whether intermittently or continuously, in his theoretical inferences or practical actions and plans. Now he's going to go in the next paragraphs and unpack some of these elements of his definition. So I'll save some of my criticism. But my own feeling is that only the first couple lines of that paragraph count as a definition, while the other part seems more like a description. So I would say that the definitional part of this is the positive cognitive attitude toward a proposition, whereas then when he talks about an action-guiding mental state that on which a person relies and does this, that, and the other thing, in my mind, those are just describing features of beliefs once you already know what a belief is. They don't really pick it out from other mental conditions or such things. But let's hear what he says. The different aspects of this characterization can be briefly explained. The mental states or cognitive attitudes that we call a person's beliefs are distinguished from each other by the propositions that are their intended objects. Belief is not merely the entertaining of a thought or a hypothesis, but a positive attitude toward a proposition, meaning that one relies upon it, whether self-consciously, as in assent, or not in guiding one's actions. Those actions can be mental, e.g. drawing an inference from certain propositions, verbal, e.g. asserting something to be the case, or physical, e.g. purchasing the item you believe to be the best buy. Actions that are consequent upon a belief are not always of all three kinds, though. People have been known to behave outwardly in terms of a belief that is too painful to assert verbally. Also, verbal assertions of one's beliefs may involve deception and error. E.g., your friends may recognize in light of your social behavior the hollowness of your avowal of racial equality, even when you do not suspect yourself of insincerity. Yeah, I'm not sure this is such a good illustration, quite frankly, because probably the person he's thinking of that protests, I'm colorblind, I believe in racial equality, but then betrays some belief or attitude that Bahnsen finds incompatible with that initial belief, and hence insincerity, probably could be unpacked under discussion. In other words, there's a dialectical aspect when you use a complex illustration like that, such that I'm not sure that's a good example of deception or even error, but rather the need for dialectical unfolding, such that that initial kind of politically correct statement, I'm colorblind, I think everybody should be equal, had embedded meanings in it that weren't disclosed in the first enunciation. Top of page 161. It should be further noted that a belief need not always be manifesting itself. The mental state can often be quiescent, and even its active mode may be merely periodic, depending upon the person's changing circumstance and other attitudes or desires. However, the capacity of the mental state to cause mental, verbal, and physical activity is not dependent upon some outside stimulus, as a behaviorist might suggest, but can be exercised at will by the person who believes the proposition in question. I think he's making the same point that I did earlier with the proverbial stereotyped nun whacking you in the wrist with a ruler. She can induce or compel a certain outward behavior and even the statement of an alleged belief, perhaps, but no one can get inside your soul and actually make you to believe something that you don't believe. Meaning that the will is in fact involved, even in our, let me not say in all beliefs. So our will is involved, certainly in the grasping of some beliefs that we have. So the final paragraph of this section, he talks about that this great variegation of meanings of these terms is also, we find that to be the case in Scripture. And there's 50, I counted 50 Scripture citations that he puts in parentheses, which obviously I'm not going to read through and discuss critically. Mention that so that the reader that's thinking about buying the book will have another reason maybe to buy the book. The various aspects of this conception of belief are reflected in Scripture. Knowledge is not separated from belief, and belief is a positive attitude toward propositions that have been heard or read. Belief is treated as a datable event, as well as a state of mind. That state of mind may be temporary or enduring. This depends upon whether the faith comes from God and is grounded in Him or not. When men live in faith, their belief comes to expression whenever an occasion requires it. However, in another sense, their faith is continuously operative in life. Belief carries different degrees of confidence. It expresses itself in one's mental inferences, in one's verbal remarks, and in one's actions. Finally, there is a sense in which belief is not simply a passive response to external stimuli, but an active expression of one's will, since it is morally enjoined upon man both at its inception and in its continuing operation. So the next section begins at the bottom of page 161 under the title Truth. So here again, he's going to start by kind of churning up all the ways that the word truth can be used in ordinary language, indicating some of the problems and ambiguities. And then he's going to very quickly kind of sketch out some of the major approaches among philosophers to resolving the question of what is truth. How does truth relate to our beliefs and our propositions? And to peek ahead to the answer at the end, the punchline is going to be that all of these approaches that the philosophers take have some merit and some advantages, but all of them also have defects. And so the Van Tilian appropriation is going to be to step back to what he calls the Christian view of truth, which is then able to navigate all of these approaches that secular philosophers take, pulling out that which is good in each one and rejecting others. So it starts at the bottom of page 161. At any rate, knowing something is a case of believing it. Yet, knowledge is clearly more than a mere belief. It often happens that two people believe propositions that contradict each other. One asserts a claim, e.g. Winston Churchill was elected to Parliament in 1900, while the other denies it. In such a case, both people cannot know what they have asserted. It is either the case that Churchill was elected in 1900 or it is not. At least one of them is mistaken. Well, in this case, I think only one of them can be mistaken if it's set up as a negation. Churchill was elected in 1900. If the other proposition is it's not the case that Churchill was elected in 1900, then one and only one of those is true and one or only one is false. But if somebody said 1900 and somebody said 1904, they could both be wrong, but they couldn't both be right. As experience shows only too often, not everything that people believe proves to be true. And whenever a proposition or claim turns out to be false, nobody can be said to have known that proposition, even though someone sincerely believed that it was true. A man may honestly believe that Mount Rushmore is located in California, but he cannot really know it for the simple reason that the claim is not accurate. Again, I think some of these assertions could be challenged and discussed even among Van Tilians. The thing that's always bothered me about the truth criterion for tagging a proposition as knowledge is that it kind of seems question-begging somewhat to me, because if you can determine that the proposition is false, then of course that would be a falsifier, and then you could say it's not knowledge. But how do you do the opposite? How do you vouchsafe that the proposition is true and therefore the holder of it has knowledge? To show that it's true requires a verification criterion or an interlocking with other statements that you know to be true, and so forth. He'll talk about some of this as the chapter develops, but I myself feel like this definition is going to require some refinement, but it does have the pedigree of centuries of affirmation, so let's go with it. So then instances of knowing are instances of believing, but one can know a proposition only if it is true. Most everybody has an intuitive understanding of what it means for a proposition to be true. In common sense or ordinary usage, we say that a proposition is true if it states what is the case, conforms to the facts, or to reality, accords with the actual state of affairs, or is correct. It is one thing to offer an adequate synonym for true, but quite another to set forth a theory of truth, something that philosophers have struggled to do. It should be noted, though, that different philosophical theories of truth are not necessarily in conflict with each other, since they may address different aspects of the matter. For example, the correspondence theory attempts to explain the nature of the property called truth. The coherence or pragmatic theories attempt to explain the evidence for the presence of that property. And the semantic and performative theories attempt to explain the logical structure or function of sentences using that term. Each of these theories has its own drawbacks. For instance, the correspondence theory, that true sentences parallel or picture extramental reality, either rests upon a crude and unworkable metaphor, or speaks of correspondence with abstract entities, e.g. states of affairs, facts, that cannot be explained and individuated apart from reference to true propositions, which the theory was supposed to explain in the first place. So again, to use that earlier example of the cat is on the mat, the correspondence theory says that the word cat corresponds to this object out there, the cat, and same with the mat, that corresponds with an object. And then the sentential connectives is describing a relationship between that one object and the other object, namely of hovering above spatially and making contact. And Bahnsen is just pointing out that to justify this theory of what it means to be true is sort of question-begging, because in order to even describe it, you have to assume that you can make these true connectives. The object known as the cat is an animal that's out there. The object known as the mat is a physical, etc. So in other words, those are already propositions that are used to describe the theory of truth, but we're trying to explain what it means for a proposition to be true. So it's kind of an infinite regress. Similarly, the coherence theory relies on the premise that two inconsistent propositions cannot both be true, thus unwittingly invoking the very thing, truth, that the theory was to explain. The pragmatic theory that true sentences are corroborated by their practical results presupposes that we know in advance what results should truly be expected from any sentence. Or worse, allows that any sentence is true just as long as somebody believes that the satisfying conditions for its practical effects have been fulfilled. I'm going to skip the paragraph. He goes through the semantic theory. It's somewhat abstruse, and I think without more background, I don't fully understand. Like if I was hearing him give this next paragraph, I would have questions, clarification questions. Do you mean this or do you mean that? And I'm not sure it really adds to the point. So I'll skip the paragraph on the semantic theory and the performative theory. Last paragraph on page 163, finally. The Christian's approach to the notion of truth is both more basic than those usually considered and also less formal, more substantial, more personal. The believer understands that truth fundamentally is whatever conforms to the mind of God. Thus, the Bible applies the term not only to the facts, since they are all predetermined by the mind of God, but also to what is eternal and absolute, as well as to what is ethically right. Because God is faithful, His word, reflecting His mind, is not contradictory, and He Himself never contradicts it. Propositions that correspond to God's mind will therefore be coherent with each other. Moreover, as the book of Proverbs drives home over and over again, in numerous ways, the most pragmatic way to live in God's world, the most efficient and successful strategy for living, is to submit to the guidance of God's wisdom. And so here's finally going to be the punchline of summarizing the Van Tilian approach to these questions. Top of page 164. Van Til's presuppositional approach to apologetics has often been misconstrued as endorsing one of the theories of truth that have been advanced by different schools of philosophy, when in fact Van Til condemned and endorsed them all in terms of the broader worldview that gives them their particular character. Van Til did not endorse one or the other, but was content to incorporate them all within a broader revelational epistemology. Even more fundamentally, Van Til realized that the revelational or Christian approach to the theory of knowledge and the non-revelational, non-Christian approach do not see the problems of epistemology in the same light. They differ over what are the most basic issues, the relevant problems to be solved, and the way in which they understand successful methods of knowing. And my comment on this would be that the very fact that we can discuss these things and yet know kind of what we're talking about, but yet have these vigorous disagreements as to what the terms are based on or what their validation criterion is and so forth and so on, and yet what would seem like we're just totally confused and no one knows what we're talking about, yet we all seem to still know what beliefs are and what knowledge is. That is itself a transcendental insight, because we ourselves, our very mind is able to transcend itself to regard these objects that we're talking about, or these mental constructs, and make them objects of discussion coherently in a way that that makes sense. So my own approach is to kind of add that to this Van Tilian toolbox of analysis. But continuing with Bahnsen. Christian philosophy is a way of restating what God has authoritatively revealed about himself, the world, man, etc., the Christian worldview, and thus the way in which we know anything at all is first and foremost a matter of revelation. Once this revelational context is understood, the Christian philosopher does not advocate, in the secular sense, a coherence theory of truth over a correspondence theory, or vice versa. Indeed, the Christian understands the most important kind of correspondence and the most important kind of coherence in ways that are quite different from and objectionable to unbelieving philosophers. Moreover, the Christian does not choose deductive reasoning over inductive reasoning, nor inductive over deductive. This is a false dilemma from Van Til's perspective. As understood and used by men who presuppose their autonomy from God, both kinds of reasoning are hostile to Christianity. Understood within the Christian framework, both kinds of reasoning are equally acceptable and necessary for the believer. So with that setting, Bahnsen then goes into a presentation of Van Til's material, the readings. And it's an extensive enough reading with many sub-paragraph identifiers that I'm going to make that into a separate presentation, lest we become fatigued with too much material. So we'll continue next time. See you then.